Okay, and we are live.
Uhuru, and welcome to our study today. And, I just want to thank everybody for coming out to this powerful presentation that we're going to hear tonight and this discussion, and to say that this program tonight is hosted by the African People's Solidarity Committee. And this is a great day because this is an opportunity for us as white people to begin to deepen our understanding of the world as it really is, not as we want to hear it, but something that we can only do through the leadership of the African working class and the African Revolution. My name is Penny Hess, and I am honored to be the chair of the African People's Solidarity Committee, which was created by the African People's Socialist Party in 1976. We work under their leadership, and the African People's Socialist Party created us as a white organization to extend the struggle for Black power onto the pedestal of the white population behind enemy lines, with a particular role to articulate the struggle for Black power as white people. So it's very exciting. Our work is organizing other white people to stand in genuine solidarity with the struggle of African people for national liberation, for the liberation of their continent and the return of all their resources for Africa and for African people everywhere, and stand in solidarity with all oppressed and colonized peoples for their liberation, and we fight for reparations and genuine solidarity. So I want to begin by saluting Chairman Omali Yeshitela for his brilliant leadership as the foremost leader of the African Revolution today. He is the chair of the African People's Socialist Party. He is the chair of the African National, for the African International, sorry. And he leads the study, Omali Taught Me, every Sunday at 8 a.m. Eastern, and broadcasts every Wednesday at 3 p.m. from his Chairman Omali Yeshitela Facebook page. As always, the analysis that we will hear tonight will be based on the understanding of the political theory of African internationalism of the African People's Socialist Party. So I have also the honor of working under the leadership of the Office of Deputy Chair Onisene Yeshitela. I salute her brilliant leadership over the more than 50 self-determination institutions of the African People's Socialist Party, and as the deputy chair, leads so many aspects of the work on the ground, including the incredible Black Power Blueprint. So tonight, we're going to continue to look at the defining issue and the main contradiction in the world today, the question of colonialism. And this time we are talking about the question of colonialism as it manifests itself in the colonial state of Israel. Tonight's study is called "It is Every Jew's Responsibility to Oppose the Colonial-Settler State of Israel." The study tonight is presented by our comrade Jesse Neville, the chair of the Uhuru Solidarity Movement and a member of the Central Committee of the African People's Solidarity Committee, again, under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party. Jesse is an organizer, speaker, writer, and the coordinator of the campaign to make Wall Street pay reparations to African people. So we welcome your questions. Please submit any questions in the Q&A feature of Zoom at the bottom of the screen. The chat feature is not available, but if you are on Facebook, please enter any questions into the Facebook chat. So I want to salute you, and looking forward to tonight's presentation. Uhuru Chair Jesse, take it away.
Uhuru, thank you, Chairwoman Penny Hess. And I'm very honored to have been asked to present on this topic tonight on this study hosted by the African People's Solidarity Committee. And I just really want to appreciate our chairwoman, Penny Hess, for the introduction and for leading the African People's Solidarity Committee under the leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela since the founding of the African People's Solidarity Committee in 1976, setting the stand for what principled white solidarity with African liberation looks like. And I just want to appreciate everybody who came on to this study today. I want to join Chairwoman Penny in saluting the leadership of the party and Deputy Chair Onezene Yeshitela for all of Deputy Chair's incredible work making African internationalism real in the world. And I also want to acknowledge the leadership of Chairman Omali Yeshitela, the founder and leader of the Uhuru movement, under whose leadership we in the African People's Solidarity Committee have the honor to work. And I want to acknowledge the theory of African internationalism that Chairman Omali Yeshitela worked to develop and create to lead the revolutionary struggle of colonized African people and all colonized people around the world for national liberation and socialism. And it is the political theory of African internationalism, the world through the eyes of the African working class, the world through the eyes of the enslaved, the colonized, and the exploited, that is the basis for the presentation that I am about to give. And 100%, all of the conclusions that are in this study today would have been impossible for me to arrive at if not for Chairman Omali Yeshitela and the theory of African internationalists and African internationalism. And I am a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee, which means that I am an African internationalist. I am a white person who has embraced African internationalism as my worldview. And it's a great honor to be a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee, working under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party to go into the white community, to win white people to the stand of principled unity with the struggle of Africans, indigenous people, Mexican people, and Palestinians and other colonized peoples that are fighting for power and freedom and an end to the colonial oppression that they face. And as a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee, and as a person who was raised in a Jewish family, I want to start off by saying unequivocally, without any ambiguity or compromise, that I fully unite with the African People's Socialist Party's position of 100% unconditional solidarity with the struggle of the Palestinian people for liberation and self-determination, that the land that is currently occupied by the state of Israel belongs to the Palestinian people. It does not belong to me. It does not belong to European Jews. It does not belong to so-called Israelis. That the white people in Israel who call themselves Jews or Israelis are not native to that land, but are there as settlers and as colonizers. Just as white people here in the United States are not native to this land, just as this land still belongs to the indigenous people, Palestine still belongs to the Palestinians. And the only way forward for Jewish people, white Jewish people in Israel or in the United States, and white people everywhere for that matter, is to stand in principled material solidarity with the Palestinians and other colonized peoples to reclaim their land, win their national liberation, and seize power over their lives and destinies. And I am certain this message will resonate with thousands, if not hundreds of thousands and millions of other Jewish people, because part of why we felt it was important to hold this study is that we can see that there are many Jewish people, especially in the younger generation, who are growing disillusioned with the state of Israel. There was a time when this would have been unheard of. And today it is encouraging to hear young Jewish people showing little to no enthusiasm for the Israel that our parents tried to convince us was the key to our survival as a people. Even a mainstream Hollywood celebrity like Seth Rogen recently made a stir when he came out and said that he has no love for Israel, that he would never visit there, and that he resents the fact that as a Jewish child, he was lied to when he was given the false impression that no one lived there when the Jews arrived on that land. Jewish people are taught all of our lives that we must be loyal to the state of Israel, that no sin is greater for a Jew to commit than to betray the almighty state of Israel. This unquestioning, often irrational sense of loyalty is bolstered by a highly well-funded and far-reaching Zionist indoctrination campaign that succeeded for a long time in winning the majority of Jewish people to opportunistically unite with Israel, to become collaborators with that regime in its brutal genocide against the Palestinians and the continued theft of Palestinian land. But the world is changing. Colonized peoples are rising up from Minneapolis to the West Bank, and we are seeing white people, and including Jewish white people, who want to take a stand, who want to stand against what Israel does in our name and in our presumed interest. So this study is for everyone who wants to be on the right side of history, but it is especially for Jewish people who are looking for a way to understand how to make sense of the fact that a community that likes to pride itself on a moral sense of justice and a hostility to oppression has become the oppressor, the murderer, the rapist, the colonizer of the Palestinians. Once we face these grim realities, we have to do something. We have to take a principled stand. So what does that look like for Jews in Israel? What does it look like for us here in the United States? Towards that end, we will talk about, towards the end of this presentation, why the most important thing we can do to support the Palestinian people is to join in principled solidarity and unity with the African Revolution right here inside the United States. So, the first thing we have to be clear about, if we go to the next slide. The first thing we have to be clear about when we talk about Israel is what is Israel? What is the state of Israel? The state of Israel, as Chairman Amalia Shatella has said many times, in no uncertain terms, is an illegitimate white nationalist colonial settler state. And that's not even some kind of emotional or subjective characterization. That is an objective reality. And it's important to say that because the bourgeois media, most of the time, will treat the so-called Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even calling it that, assumes that there are two equal entities that are at war with each other, that perhaps are carrying out an ancient religious conflict that has been going on for thousands of years. Wrong. Palestine is colonized and occupied by a colonial settler state called the State of Israel, a colonial settler state in which the colonizer population has left where they are from in Europe and come to other people's lands and pushed those people off their land or killed them and created colonial settlements. And just like the United States is a colonial settler state. South Africa is a colonial and now a neo-colonial settler state. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, these are colonial settler states that, like the state of Israel, were established through the invasion of European settlers. And in this case, European Jews who occupied Palestine and established a colonial state power and a government to enforce their control of Palestinian land and resources. And, you know, this is important to say because Israel is new. Israel is a recent invention in the colonial history. Israel is the same age as my father. It has not always been there. The Israeli state was established first with the support of the British, then later with the support of the United Nations and US imperialism. And it was founded in 1948. That's how old Israel is. It's not old at all. After a brutal period of massacres, expulsions of the Palestinians carried out by Jewish settler terrorists in what is referred to as the Nakba, which we will be talking about later. So we wanted to say something about colonialism. Chairman Amalia Shatella has been fighting for us to understand the main contradiction in the world. You have to understand the main contradiction in the world in order to understand everything else. And the main contradiction in the world is colonialism. And as the Uhuru movement defines it, colonialism is the total domination of a whole people by a hostile foreign state power for the economic benefit and the political advantage of the oppressor nation. The Palestinians are colonized. The indigenous people in this land are colonized. The Mexican people are colonized. So are Africans inside the United States and around the world. They're colonized. And that means that we white people are the colonizer. We are the oppressor nation who benefits from their subjugation. And as the chairman, Amalia Shatella, has made so crystal clear, the problem faced by Africans and Palestinians and other colonized peoples is their colonization, is colonialism, not racism, the ideology used to justify colonialism, the ideas in the minds of white people that are created to justify a global economy built on the backs of the enslavement of African people and colonialism and genocide against the oppressed peoples of the world. Capitalism was born from colonialism. It was born parasitic. And I want to just show you this book. It's called Vanguard. And actually, this is a different book, but you should check out Vanguard as well. But this is a book, An Uneasy Equilibrium, written by Chairman Amalia Shatella. And there is a chapter in that book that is repeated, that is quoted in the book Vanguard, also written by the chairman, in which he says the following statement: capitalism was born in disrepute, born of the rapes, massacres, occupations, genocides, colonialism, and every despicable act humans are capable of inflicting on others. Capitalism was not responsible for some great, otherwise unimaginable leap in production, which despite its contradictions resulted in progress and enlightenment. What capitalism did was to rip the vast majority of humanity out of the productive process in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, Australia, and what has come to be known as the Americas. Capitalism, with its roots in colonialism, is the means by which all sectors of white society have sought to advance our station in life on the backs of the oppression of the exploited and colonized peoples of the world. That is as true of white people who faced poverty in feudal Europe and left to conquer the so-called Americas and Africa as it is of the Jewish people who went to colonize Palestine. And we have to understand the Israeli situation in that context. So that brings us to this thing called Zionism. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about Zionism. As the slide says, Zionism emerged in the context of 19th century European imperialism. So Zionism was founded in the late 1800s in Eastern Europe. And today, Zionism is often presented as just this natural expression of the Jewish experience, this longing of the Jewish people to reunite with their homelands, to go back to Jerusalem. It's stated in prayers and things like that, to be reunited with the land promised to Jews by God as the homeland of the so-called chosen people. That mythology is an ideological justification for colonialism, just like racism. And like racism, Zionism is a set of ideas used to justify the theft of land, the murder of native people, the establishment of a white colonial settler state in which European wealth, in this case enjoyed by white people who call themselves Jews, is linked to the misery and poverty of the Palestinians. The ideology and political movement of Zionism was created by European Jews who were clear that they were operating on the trajectory of European imperialism. And the chairman has made this really clear, that Europe came into existence as a white and Christian nation. So Jews have faced persecution inside of Europe historically. Living in a Christian white society, there has definitely been a history of oppression faced by Jewish people. And in the face of that, you had many different programs that the Jews of Europe came up with to try to reconcile that and try to resolve those contradictions. Zionism was a minority opinion in the European Jewish world at that time. Most Jews were assimilationists. Some were socialists. Some were anarchists. Among these contending ideologies was Zionism. And Zionism was created by middle-class, secular European Jews. So contrary to the popular perception that this was a religious movement of fundamentalist Jews yearning to reunite with their homeland, most of the Zionist movement's founding fathers did not even believe in the God that they claimed had given Jews Palestine 2,000 years ago. The Zionist movement in Europe was consolidated less than a decade after the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 85, where European powers came together in Berlin to carve up Africa among themselves. And in fact, the Zionist settlement in Palestine, Zionists started going to Palestine in 1882, 2 years before the Berlin Conference. So we can go to the next slide. So this man right here is Theodor Herzl, the founder of political Zionism. He publishes the manifesto of the Zionist movement in 1897. It's called The Jewish State. And this was an Austro-Hungarian Jewish man, and he worked really hard to win the support of the major imperialist powers, especially the British, for the Zionist project. And he didn't have to work that hard because most of them supported it already, even before he came along. And in fact, the Jewish State subtitle was Jewish State, an Address to the Rothschilds. That was the full title of the book. And Herzl was really clear that he had to convince, and he would be able to convince, the major imperialist powers that there was a strategic advantage for the creation of a European colonial settler state in the Middle East, where Europe was looking to get access to those people's resources. So he wrote, for Europe, quote, "We would constitute a bulwark against Asia. We would be the advanced post of civilization against barbarism. As a neutral state, we will remain in constant touch with all of Europe, which will guarantee our existence." Theodor Herzl. So I also want you to know that before Herzl and the Zionists decided upon Palestine, because Palestine does have a religious significance in Judaism, that's why they ended up choosing that, or that was part of why they thought it would be marketable to a lot of Jews to choose that. But before they decided on Palestine, they floated around some other options for the Jewish state. Uganda, Kenya, Australia, Argentina were all on the menu of potential destinations for the Jewish state. And once they finally decided on Palestine, then they had to start laying out the necessary measures in order to deal with the inconvenient fact that people already lived in Palestine and had lived there for thousands of years. The geographical entity called Palestine has been a recognized country at least since Roman times, probably known as Palestine even before that. Palestine was a thriving Arab society, mostly rural, with vibrant urban centers. You should read this book right here, Overturning the Culture of Violence, written by Chairwoman Penny Hess, who introduced this study. She talks about the European Crusades, which sought to conquer Palestine in the 11th century. And she describes how Palestine was resplendent with rich agriculture and industry and towns and historical cities. And over 500,000 people lived in Palestine before the Zionist invaders arrived. So it was not, as the Zionists like to say, a land without a people for a people without a land. We can go to the next slide. And the other thing you need to know is that Muslims, Jews, and Christians coexisted in Palestine for over 1,000 years before the Zionist invasion. So this destroys this whole concept that this is just something between Muslims and Jews and it's some old religious war that's never going to be resolved, and it's too messy and complex for you to even understand. So 1882 to 1914 was when what the Zionists refer to as the first Aliyah and the second Aliyah took place. These were the first two major waves of Zionist settler invasion. Jews from all over Europe came into Palestine, started buying up land, laying the foundation for the eventual takeover. The Jewish National Fund, which still exists today, began purchasing land and laying the patchwork for total Zionist occupation. At this time, Palestine was under the authority of the Ottomans. That was starting to change with the Second Imperialist War. And in 1916, this thing happened that was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And I really appreciate Chairman Amalia Shatella for bringing this thing to light, because anytime you hear about Syria, you hear about Iraq, you hear about Lebanon, you hear about all this stuff that's going on in the Middle East, in the bourgeois media, you're not given any historical context. And the chairman always brings it back to the history of colonialism, how the colonizers went into the Middle East and carved it up, just like they carved it up like a cake. They carved up Africa at the Berlin Conference. The Sykes-Picot Agreement was the French and the British. They sat down with a map and they said, okay, we're going to have our eyes set on this area over here. You guys can have your eyes set on that area over there. And that is the basis for the borders, the arbitrary borders that form the different countries, so-called, in the Middle East, have their roots in the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a secret treaty signed between the French and the British. A year after the Sykes-Picot Agreement, this is a really important date in the history of the destruction of the Palestinian nation and the theft of Palestine by the Zionist Jews, because this was when the British officially pledged their support for the Zionist colonization of Palestine. It's called the Balfour Declaration. This is a real document. Palestine for the Jews, official sympathy. The Balfour Declaration was a public statement issued by the British government announcing support for the establishment of a national homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. And this was a document that was written by the United Kingdom's Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, and addressed to Lord Rothschild for transmission to the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. So 3 years after that, as the Ottoman control of that region is destroyed by the British imperialism, the imperialists get back together for another meeting, this time in Italy, to decide who is officially going to take control of what in the Middle East. This is where what is now considered the borders of Iraq were consolidated. And they met and decided that Iraq and Palestine would come under a British mandate, Syria would come under a French mandate. So this is when Palestine officially comes under British control. And as the chairman says, the League of Nations, which formed the basis for the United Nations, was formed by imperialist powers to maintain peace amongst them, amongst the thieves and the murderers, as they divided up the colonized world. And the chairman compares it to when you have a bunch of mafia families that come together to sign contracts on how they're going to divide up the turf. This is the same exact thing. So just to reiterate, Jewish Zionist settlers have already started occupying Palestine by this point, taking over Palestinian land. They got official support from the British government, and now the British government has officially taken over control of Palestine. So the period between 1920 and 1947 is referred to as the mandatory period because Palestine is under a British mandate. And this is the period in which the Zionist invasion of settlers into Palestine really starts to accelerate. So during this time, Jewish Zionist settlers begin assaulting and murdering Palestinians to steal more of their land, as well as waging war against the British colonizers, competing with them over who is going to be the main group of settlers who will control Palestine. So I just want you to think about that. And does that sound familiar to you? One group of Europeans came to this land, start stealing the land from the native people. The British are in control, and now the other group of settlers is fighting for independence from the British so that they can have control over the stolen land of the native people. It's the exact same thing as what happened here with the so-called American Revolution and independence from the British. It's a contest between settler colonizers for control of stolen land. So while this is going on, I want to take you to Germany for a minute. So let's head on over to Germany, because this is a very underreported on fact of history that I think reveals a lot about the Zionist movement. Havara agreement means the transfer agreement. This was an agreement between Zionist Jews in Germany and the Nazi government. They had a convergence of interests. The Nazis didn't want Jews in Germany. The Zionists wanted to colonize Palestine. So the Nazi government and the Zionist Jews came together and said, hey, why don't we have a little collaboration here and work together to get Jews to Palestine? So they did that. This was at a time when there was an international Jewish boycott of German goods, but the Zionists broke an international boycott of German goods to enter into this economic agreement with Nazi Germany. And this is an actual coin from Nazi Germany. On the one side of the coin is a swastika, and on the other side of the coin is the Star of David. So I wanted to bring this up because the Holocaust, the so-called Nazi Holocaust, which was the murder of Jews in Europe by the Nazi government, is used by Zionists as the ultimate justification for the state of Israel. And I just want to say how ridiculous that is, because first of all, as we just saw, the Zionists collaborated with the Nazis. Secondly, the Zionist invasion of Palestine started in 1882. I don't think that they were thinking about Hitler in 1882 when they were invading Palestine. And thirdly, as Chairman Amalia Shatella has said, if it was for reparations from Germany that the Jews needed a state power, then why didn't they take Frankfurt or Berlin? The Palestinians had nothing to do with what happened to Jews in Europe. And I absolutely agree with that. So let's go back to Palestine. So while all this is happening, the Palestinians have always resisted. So they start rising up. Between 1936 and 1939 is what's referred to as the Great Revolt, where the Palestinians are resisting British imperialism, resisting Jewish settler colonialism. It begins with a general strike by Arab workers, and it explodes into full-scale rebellion that ultimately is crushed by the British, who use the same counterinsurgency tactics, collective punishment, demolition of homes, later to be notoriously adopted and used against the Palestinians by the illegitimate colonial settler state of Israel. So things get a little heated for the British, and they decide to wash their hands of the situation and turn it over to the United Nations in 1947. The United Nations, which is an instrument of imperialism and always has been, partitions the land of Palestine between the settlers and the Palestinians. So the Jewish people are still a minority of the population in Palestine at this point, the Jewish European settlers. But the UN gives the Palestinians 42% of the land on which 818,000 Palestinians would have a state, so-called, that would include 10,000 Jews, while the Jewish state is supposed to stretch for almost 56% of the land, on which only 500,000 Jews would exist, along with the 438,000 Palestinians who would be left there. So the whole thing was a complete sham and just a legal cover for the theft of the Palestinian land for the Zionist entity. But even that was not tenable for the Zionists. It wasn't enough. They wanted it all. So they accepted the UN's partition, and then they went into action to work against it. And they had to make themselves the majority. That was their goal. So the only way to make themselves the majority was to push out the Palestinians and kill them. And that brings us to 1947, 1948, what is remembered in the Palestinian history as Al-Nakba, which is Arabic for the catastrophe. And this was a profoundly brutal campaign of murder and terror waged by organizations, by gangs of Jewish terrorists. And anyone who doesn't like me calling them gangs, it was called the Stern Gang. That was the name of it. The Irgun, the Haganah, these were Jewish gangs of terrorists who got together and expelled the Palestinian people, exterminated the Palestinian population. By the time this was over, they kicked out 80% of the indigenous Palestinian people from their homeland. They methodically went through in something that was called Plan Dalet. They had meetings, they would plan it out, they would map it out. They would mark it on a map, all the villages that had to be destroyed and subdued. Over 530 Palestinian villages were destroyed. They used flamethrowers. They put typhoid germs into the water of a 200-year-old aqueduct. 800,000 Palestinians were driven from their homeland. They used machine guns. And I just want to share with you because I want to just take a minute to talk about this, because I think it's one of the most important things that anyone would need to know about the state of Israel is how it was born. And this is a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It's a very chilling book because it just goes through step by step, village by village, and documents, in many cases, using the actual testimonies and official documents of the Israelis themselves, what they did to the Palestinians in the year leading up to the formal establishment of the state of Israel. So on page 90 here, this is very brief. It says, on April 9th, 1948, Jewish forces occupied the village of Deir Yassin. It lay on a hill west of Jerusalem, 800 meters above sea level, and close to the Jewish neighborhood of Givat Shaul. The old village school serves today as the mental hospital for the Western Jewish neighborhood that expanded over the destroyed village. There's interesting symbolism there. As they burst into the village, the Jewish soldiers sprayed the houses with machine gun fire, killing many of the inhabitants. The remaining villagers were then gathered in one place and murdered in cold blood, their bodies abused, while a number of the women were raped and then killed. Fahim Zaidan, who was 12 years old at the time, recalled how he saw his family murdered in front of his eyes. They took us out one after the other, shot an old man, and when one of his daughters cried, she was shot too. Then they called my brother Muhammad and shot him in front of us. And when my mother yelled, bending over him, carrying my little sister Hudra in her hands, still breastfeeding her, they shot her too. Later on in this book, it talks about another example of what went into the establishment of the state of Israel. In this example, a platoon of soldiers in the Negev, based in a kibbutz, Niram, not far from Beit Hanun, on the northern edge of today's Gaza Strip, Jewish soldiers captured a 12-year-old Palestinian girl and locked her up for the night in their military base near the kibbutz. For the next few days, she became the platoon's sex slave as the soldiers shaved her head, gang raped her, and in the end, murdered her. David Ben-Gurion, who was the leader of this genocidal process and became the first prime minister of Israel, listed this rape in his diary, but it was censored out by his editors when it was later published. So all of this culminates in May 15th. If we go to the next slide, May 15th, 1948, the Israelis mark this day as the Day of Israeli Independence. The Palestinians call it Nakba Day. By this point, 800,000 Palestinians had been made refugees beyond the borders of the Israeli state. Zionist forces had taken more than 78% of historic Palestine, killed at least 15,000 Palestinians, including more than 70 massacres. And today, there are more than 7 million Palestinian refugees scattered around the world. 1967, colonialism never stops. It's not like colonialism gets satisfied once it takes over a certain piece of land. The Israelis wanted to keep going. They wanted to take all of it. So in 1967, they launched a war, and this war was called the Six-Day War. And as a result of this war, waged against Palestine and neighboring Arab states, they annexed even more land. So at the end of this war, the Israeli state expanded its colonial territory. They took over what is the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights, which is in Syria. So there is a part of Syria, the Syrian Golan Heights, that is part of the Israeli state that has been occupied by Israel since 1967. And the carnage against the Palestinians was not limited to Israeli terror against Palestinians inside of Israeli borders. The Palestinian refugees experienced nothing close to refuge. In September 16th through the 18th, 1982, 3,500 Palestinian refugees were slaughtered by Israeli-backed forces in the refugee camps of Sabra and Shat. Today, 500,000 Palestinians still live in refugee camps in Lebanon. And Lebanon has been in the news because a few days ago, there were horrific, massive explosions in Beirut that killed hundreds of people, that injured thousands, and that displaced 300,000 people from their homes and destroyed infrastructure. There is a lot of suspicion that Israel had something to do with it. I can't say for one way or the other in this study if that's the case, but why would I doubt that? They've done it before. The US and Israel have bombed and slaughtered the people of Lebanon over and over and over again. It's nothing they haven't done before. In fact, Israel just attacked southern Lebanon last month. The Palestinian people have always fought back, heroically resisted, struggled to reclaim their land, to push out the occupier, and to free their people. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, Fatah, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was a revolutionary communist Palestinian organization, fought throughout the 60s and 70s to liberate Palestine from the Zionist entity, and also had a unity with anti-colonial people around the world. And there's a lot that we could say, we don't have time, but there's a lot that we could say about the Palestinian revolution, their creation of dual power. They created their own economy. They had Palestinians that would acquire sewing machines to sew in order to generate some kind of resources. They trained their own military forces. They have always waged a powerful resistance to Israeli settler colonial domination. And that extends to the broader Palestinian masses. The Palestinian people as a whole have always fought back. Two major popular uprisings that sustained over the course of years in the face of brutal Israeli counterinsurgency are known as the First Intifada between 1987 and 1994, and the Second Intifada from 2000 to 2005. During the Second Intifada, the state of Israel built a separation barrier, a wall, through the West Bank, effectively annexing even more land because it cuts through the West Bank. So they put this giant separation border through the West Bank to contain the Palestinian people in the West Bank, and then started building settlements, which means that more and more Jews coming into the occupied territories in the West Bank to create settlements and further take over what little Palestinian land is left. 500,000 Jewish settlers live in settlements scattered all over the West Bank, protected by the Israeli armed forces, as well as in Arab East Jerusalem. In 2006, Israel imposed the genocidal blockade on Gaza, blocking food and medicine. Hamas, which is an Islamic resistance organization, was actually elected by the people in 2006 to punish the Palestinians for democratically electing a resistance organization as its representative. Israel began to besiege Gaza, to starve the people of Gaza, to deny food and medicine. They even shot up a Turkish aid flotilla that was coming in to deliver medicine and food to the people of Gaza. Gaza is one of the world's most densely populated areas, with more than 5,000 people per square kilometer. And many Palestinians describe it as the world's largest open-air prison. 2 million Palestinians are forced to live behind a brutal genocidal blockade and are refused access to other Palestinian areas and the rest of the world. And we can go, and Israel bombs the Gaza Strip every day. There are certain periods of time when the bombing really intensifies, and the Israeli state always gives them very sinister names. Operation Cast Lead, Operation Protective Edge, they give them these disturbing names. But the truth is, there isn't a day that goes by that Israel is not involved in some kind of brutal terror and war against the people of Gaza. And in 2014, during what they called Operation Protective Edge, if we could go back one slide, the Israeli Defense Forces, so-called, the Israeli occupiers, slaughtered over 2,000 Palestinian people. This picture that you see here is of 4 Palestinian children who were playing on a beach in Gaza before they were cut down by Israeli missiles. And I want to say this because sometimes you will see these things out there that say that the United States is being controlled by the Zionist lobby, or that, that Israel is in control of US foreign policy. And if only the Americans knew what Israel, the influence that Israel wields over the US, then they would rise up and do something about it, and America would be benevolent. It really makes no sense, but it flies in the face of facts. The opposite is actually true. Israel serves the interests of US imperialism. As it says here, the chairman has made this very clear. Israel is a military outpost of US imperialism, or as the chairman says, the white cop on the block. They needed a white colonial force in the Middle East to secure access to geopolitical resources in that region. And US military funding to Israel is nearly $4 billion annually, more military financing than the United States provides to all other countries combined. Palestinian and African people have always united in a common anti-colonial struggle against imperialism. And this was true in the 1960s and 70s, where the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, of which Chairman Amalia Shatella was a leading member, came out in support of the Palestinians, and the Palestinians hosted Huey P. Newton and others in Palestine. There was always a strong relationship. And in recent years, this has continued to be the case. Of course, the African People's Socialist Party has always stood up for the Palestinian people, and Chairman Amalia Shatella has always stood up in support of victory and revolutionary self-determination for the Palestinian people. 6 years ago, when the Ferguson uprisings began, you saw Palestinians and Africans in Ferguson exchanging messages on Twitter about how to deal with tear gas and things of that nature. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine issued a statement that year expressing support for the rebellions in Ferguson and saying that the US empire, this is a quote from the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, they said the US empire was built on the backs of Black slavery and the genocide of Black people, and upon settler colonialism and genocide of indigenous people. The Black struggle is the leading force in the world in the struggle for an alternative political system that will bring US empire to defeat, end quote, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And here you can see an image of George Floyd with a Palestinian flag behind him painted on the side of the separation barrier in the West Bank. So this is why we say that for us white people in the belly of the beast, joining the African People's Solidarity Committee and standing in solidarity with African people's liberation, upon whose backs the entire social and economic system of parasitic capitalism that is torturing people around the world, when we stand with the African liberation movement, that is the most meaningful way, the most direct way that we can become intimately connected in solidarity with the Palestinians and all oppressed peoples around the world. The Palestinian people have a right to free their land, to be victorious, to have a free Palestine from the river to the sea, so that never again will the laughter of Palestinian children on a beach in Gaza be cut short by the rain of Israeli missiles. And now I want to read this quote. I want to tell you a story, first of all. Some of you might know this. I want to give a shout out to Uhuru Solidarity Movement comrades in San Diego that are out there, as well as members of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement who are out in San Diego right now at a demonstration calling for reparations from Bank of America. And I'm mentioning San Diego because last year, or was that earlier this year? It's hard to remember. I think it was earlier this year. Chairman Amalia Shatella was in the news in San Diego because he was supposed to speak at a summit held by African students at San Diego State University on the topic of reparations. A Zionist Jewish professor and the Zionist Hillel Jewish student organization sabotaged that from happening. They put pressure on the administration, which it took a cowardly stance and united with their position to have the chairman disinvited from speaking, that they would withhold funding if the chairman was invited, that he would not be allowed to speak on the subject of reparations at San Diego State University because of his statements about Israel and about Jewish people. And the chairman was branded as an anti-Semite And the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement held demonstrations calling for that to be overturned and for Chairman Omali Yeshitela to be able to speak, and the absurdity of these white people coming in and deciding who gets to speak, who from the African community gets to speak on the subject of reparations to Black people. And the statement from the chairman that the Zionists at San Diego State University quoted, first of all, when I read the statement, I was like, I totally agree with that. So I'm sure they're taking it out of context still, but even out of context, I agree with it. Because basically what the chairman said was that the Zionists use the Holocaust to deflect any criticism as an ideological weapon, to deflect and deny any criticism of Israel and of imperialism. Well, I agree with that 100%. But I wanted to read the whole statement, and I want to read the whole statement to you. And I'm going to read the whole thing because it's worth hearing the whole thing. This is a statement made by Chairman Omali Yeshitela. I don't think anyone could say it better. This is the perfect summation of the topic of tonight's study. It is every Jew's responsibility to oppose the colonial settler state of Israel. This is what Chairman Omali Yeshitela said in an interview on Uhuru Radio in 2009. He said, quote, "Israel is a criminal enterprise in 1,000 different ways. And the whole thing that happened to Jews was done by white people. I don't know how many Jews were killed in Germany, but however many were killed, they killed them. They were not killed by Iranians. They were killed by white people in Europe. You talk about freedom of speech, but you cannot be in a European country and say 6 million Jews didn't die. You'll go to jail there. But we do know how many people the Belgians killed in one fell swoop. The Belgians killed more than 12 million African people. You're going to tell me," this is the chairman speaking, "that because somebody says something you don't like about an illegitimate, hostile, white nationalist state that itself was a colonial enterprise that is used against the people there, that the crimes committed by the Belgians, the crimes committed by the Dutch, the crimes committed by the United States and all these other countries go unmentioned and undealt with because we hurt the feelings of some white people who stole some land in occupied Palestine? It is absolutely unacceptable." Chairman Omali Yeshitela continues, "I truly believe that Jewish people have a responsibility to denounce the illegitimate state of Israel, to express solidarity with the just struggles of the Palestinians and other oppressed peoples." And the chairman says, "just as I sit here right now and denounce these neo-colonial African states wherever they exist. Jews are no better than anybody else. And what killed them was capitalism and other white people in Germany. Not only were they killed in Germany, they were chased all over Europe. And even in this country, Jews had to change their names and what have you. So it wasn't clear that they were Jews in order to be successful. So don't put this thing about Jews on Palestinians and Iranians and Black people, because this is a mess about white people. They're using this mess about white people that happened to the Jews. They want to hold this up as the greatest crime against humanity because it's something that happened to white people, and the Jews who unite with this whole Zionist project participate in an anti-revolutionary stance. They use it to hide the crimes that imperialism has committed against the rest of the world. That's it. That is all that needs to be said. And that's Chairman Omali Yeshitela. And I want to close by saying that I am a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee. I am an African internationalist, and I was raised as a Jewish person. I am a Jew. And if the chairman is an anti-Semite for what he said in that statement, then you can call me an anti-Semite too. And we have to refuse to be intimidated into silence on this subject by the false cry of anti-Semitism, a weapon of imperialism that is used to silence any criticism of it. We are anti-genocide. We are anti-rape. We are anti the slaughter of children. If San Diego State University thinks that makes us anti-Jewish, that says more about the way they see Jewish people than it says about us. Jews, we were white people when Germany was killing Africans in Namibia. When Leopold was in the Congo, slaughtering the people there, we were Germans, we were Belgians. When Jews came under serious attack, our solution was not to unite with the oppressed peoples of the world and overturning the system that attacked us. Our solution was to come to the United States and to try to become white people, to regain our position as white people, or to go to Israel and do that. And we know there are Jewish people out there who want to take an anti-imperialist stand, who want to rupture this legacy of opportunism and collaboration with genocide that has characterized the majority of us for the last 70 or so years since the state of Israel was formed. In order to go forward in genuine unity with the oppressed peoples of the world, we must abandon all allegiance to Israel. White people, including Jewish people, in solidarity with Palestine, must join the African People's Solidarity Committee and stand in solidarity with African liberation inside US borders. Join the movement for reparations, not as a favor, but as a revolutionary demand, because reparations means that everything that's been stolen from oppressed people must go back. It means that the stolen labor and resources of African people must go back. And yes, it means that the land of the Palestinian people must go back into the hands of the Palestinians. We have to say Israel must go. There is no two-state solution. There's no situation where they already tried that. There's no situation where the colonizer is going to have a state next to a colonized. That makes no sense. You cannot have the slave master and the enslaved living in peaceful coexistence. Israel must be defeated. Palestine must be free. And for Jewish people out there who hear those words and are fretful about, well, what's going to happen to Jewish people? Where will the Jewish people go? Well, the answer is the same for Jews in Israel as it is for us white people here in the United States on stolen indigenous land, because they're coming back for their land too. The Mexican people are coming back for their land too. And our fate will be determined by our stance. Will we attach our future to an imperialism built on land theft and murder? If so, we will suffer the same fate of imperialism. As the chairman says, for the Jewish people who refuse to relinquish our grasp on Israel, we will find our way swimming out of Palestine in a river of our own blood. Or we will stand up to our own ruling class in Israel and in the United States. We will stand in solidarity with the Palestinians, with the African community, with the Mexican people, with the indigenous people, with all oppressed people. We will refuse to do the bidding of the ruling class. We will refuse to be their lynch mob. We will refuse to be their military, their Stern gang, their Irgun, their Hergana, their IDF, their shock troops. We refuse. The future that we want to be a part of is a future where all people can live in peace. No war, no rape, no slavery, no colonialism, no Israel. Victory to Palestine, free, free Palestine from the river to the sea. Every last millimeter must be free. Victory to the African Revolution, unity through reparations. Join the African People's Solidarity Committee. Uhuru.
Uhuru. Uhuru. That was powerful, Jesse Neville. The Solidarity Committee. That was a powerful presentation. I just really want to salute you. I want to join in expressing my complete and unconditional solidarity with the Palestinian people, with their right to their land, and unite that Israel must go, imperialism must go, parasitic capitalism must go, colonialism in every front that it exists on this planet must go. And the questions that we are talking about today, this question of colonialism, is something that hits hard, something that we have to go deep. We have to go deep to hear it, because we cannot have genuine solidarity with the Palestinian people unless we are under the leadership of the African Revolution, the African People's Socialist Party. So we're going to have Q&A in just a minute. So please put it in the Q&A feature or the comment. I'm sorry, forgot which one. Please put it in the Q&A feature in Zoom, or you can put it in the comments in Facebook. So we're going to talk about this more. But before we do that, I do want to join with Comrade Jesse Neville's call for others to join the African People's Solidarity Committee. We must play our role. We must take our responsibility to change the world. And I saw a quote recently of Che Guevara. He said, "Revolution is not an apple that falls from the tree when it is ripe. You have to make it fall." And that is what the African People's Socialist Party is doing every day. It's not just making that apple fall, it's making imperialism fall. It's deepening the crisis. It's making it weaker. It's stabbing it in the heart, because we must destroy, we must be part of destroying this system that is built on the suffering of everybody else, built on rape and plunder and murder and genocide, as has been said, so that a tiny percentage of the population in this planet, and that's us, white people, the colonizers, whether we're in the United States, in Britain, in Azania, occupied Azania, which is South Africa, or in Israel, Australia, or any place else where we are the dominant colonizer force carrying out the mandates and the interests of the ruling class of imperialism. So therefore, we can't just sit back and watch this. I felt that Comrade Jesse's statement was incredibly scientific, because it was based on the understandings of African internationalism, the political understanding of seeing the world through the eyes of the African working class and oppressed and colonized peoples, to see the world as it really is, not with the lies that we learn and we adopt as the subjects of history, relegating everybody else to the objects of history. That we have the opportunity to join, and to not just join a protest, not just carry out some action, and not just take a class unlearning racism, but begin to be part of a strategy led by the African working class, led by the African People's Socialist Party, to step by step by step solve the problems that have prevented African people from being free and liberated now for hundreds of years, because this is a historical trend that began when the first European came to Africa and began stealing and kidnapping African people and turning them into commodities for sale for the benefit of white people of Europe, of creating the greatest wealth that has ever been amassed on the planet, based on the suffering of everybody else, based on slavery, based on genocide, based on land theft, based on colonialism, based on pumping opium into the oppressed peoples of the world. Anything, everything, bombs and drones and all of the things that imperialism has done from day one, which created the capitalist system, until now, that it continues to go on and on. But it is the resistance of the Palestinian people, of African workers here inside the US, who rose up so militantly and inspiringly against the police murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis at the end of May. But that was just a long string of everyday police murders and oppression of African people, because they live under colonialism right here. And that the African People's Socialist Party created an organization for white people to go into the white community, to be able to win others for revolution. And yes, we have to have revolution. Is there any possible way that this system can be saved when we look at this reality that is in the news and, you know, that is being carried out every single day by imperialism? When we look at what is happening, when we see how, you know, right now, the US has not even voted on extending any kind of benefits to the majority of the people who have lost their jobs, the majority of whom are African, Mexican, indigenous, colonized peoples inside the US, that they have gotten rid of. They have taken away the moratorium against evictions. So we're going to see, as they say, a tidal wave of more and more and more homeless people, which the majority of homeless people are Africans already. And we are going to see just a tidal wave of this. We see people, Africans, reporting that 40% of the African population inside this country can't afford to feed their family till they're full. Their children are hungry. This is inside the US. I'm not talking about what's happening and what the US is doing on the continent of Africa or throughout the Middle East, including to the Palestinian people. So I really appreciate this. And the fact is, will we take up the call? Will we take up the call? Or will we go down with this sinking ship of imperialism that the entire world is fighting to bring down? It is doing everything that it can to make it sink and toss it into the garbage can of history, to get rid of it, to wipe it off the planet of the earth. Where will we stand in that? Where will we stand in that? Will we take up this call? And the African People's Socialist Party created a cadre organization, an organization that is more than just a single issue, that is more about white people who want to say, I will be here, whatever it takes. I am going to be part and do my part to fight in this revolution led by the African working class that's bringing everybody with them on the planet who wants to come. It is not for, an imperialist idea of somebody at the expense of everybody else. This is about destroying imperialism and winning freedom and liberation. That's what the African People's Solidarity Committee represents. It says, I take responsibility for what white people did, and it's not pretty. And it's not about unlearning my racism, my ideas in my heads. It's about taking responsibility to learn what is colonialism, how did we carry it out, and taking responsibility for that and saying, I'm not united with my own ruling class. They're not gonna let me, they're not gonna count on me. They're not gonna count on me, and that this is, as Jesse laid out, but that I stand on the side of the African Revolution, which is on the side of the oppressed and colonized peoples on the planet Earth. We cannot leave this situation for another generation. So I'm asking you to seriously consider becoming a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee. Become a cadre, become someone who will take responsibility to solve the problems and take on leadership and be out there in the white community and do what we have to do to win our families, our friends, our neighbors, to turn loose our whiteness and stand in solidarity with the liberation of Africa and African people. So go to APSC Uhuru, UHURU, APSCUhuru.org. Go to the Get Involved tab, fill out the form. It's so simple. Become a member of the African People's Solidarity Committee. Make a commitment to rectify our relationship to the people on the planet Earth and to carry out our mandate and our assignment to return the stolen wealth, pay reparations, the true redistribution of the wealth of this planet Earth, and that stand in solidarity, carry out the work for the liberation of Africa and African people that we have been assigned to take on. So just go to apscuhuru.org. We will get back to you within 24 hours. Within 24 hours, join the African Revolution in genuine solidarity. So I want to see if we have any questions. I don't see any in my little form here, so I don't know. I don't know if we do have some. Jesse, do you see some questions or any kinds of things that people have been raising?
Yes, there are some. I don't know if it's frozen on your end or something. If you scroll down a little bit, there's quite a few questions actually.
Oh, okay, I'm seeing it. All right, thank you. So I'm going to read, I guess this is a comment. Virginia and Louisville says, Uhuru, viewing from Louisville where protests against police murder of African people is ongoing. I really salute and appreciate all the wonderful political education coming from the Uhuru movement. Salute Chairwoman Penny and Chair Jesse. I know the African People's Socialist Party is in solidarity with Palestinian freedom. In the party's reports to the past Congresses, has there ever been solidarity statements from Palestinian revolutionaries? And how would you compare the colonization of Palestinians with the colonization of Africans worldwide? I would just say, if I could, Jesse, I would just say that that first of all, in terms of, I've seen even videos or statements on Facebook from Palestinians totally comparing the conditions faced by Palestinians and the conditions faced by Africans colonized inside the borders of the US. So I know that, that absolutely the conditions are very, very similar. And also that wall that Jesse showed, that wall that divides, that keeps people off of their land, the Palestinian people, just as the wall on the southern false border of the United States, preventing indigenous people from crossing over into their own stolen land, as this country is stolen from the indigenous people, either indigenous people here or indigenous people of Mexico or what had been Central America, parts of the Americas, stolen land. This is what California, Texas, Utah, Nevada, these states have been stolen against Mexico within the last 125 or 50 years. So yes, it is there, and absolutely the party, the chairman and the African People's Socialist Party have always issued their statements in solidarity with the Palestinian people. I remember a time way back in the 1980s, I'll just say this very quickly, when I saw the chairman present on an event, at an event hosted by the Palestinian organization, and there were balconies there. I mean, it was absolutely packed with, I think, 3 balconies, mostly with people from the Middle East from throughout California. This was in San Francisco. And when the chairman began to speak as the leader of the African Revolution in genuine solidarity and expressing his profound solidarity with the Palestinian people, just the whole house went up in cheering. The people united will never be defeated. And it was a memorable, unforgettable moment of the profound unity between Palestinians and African people inside the borders of the US. So just would go on, the common argument I hear for Israel is that every ethnic group needs a homeland. What is the best way to counter this? So Comrade Jesse, that's from Noah on YouTube.
Noah, thank you for the question. I think, the best way to counter that is that not at the expense of the Palestinian people. The Palestinian people were pushed out of their homeland. They were denied their homeland in order for the colonial settler state of Israel to be created. And, the state of Israel wasn't created because every ethnic group needs a homeland. It was created as part and parcel of imperialism and the theft of land and resources in the Middle East. And as the chairman says, I think the chairman summed it up best when he said the Jewish people should have taken Frankfurt or should have taken Berlin. It doesn't make any sense that in response to persecution of Jews in Europe, that the Palestinians would be made to pay the price and be expelled from their homeland in order for a Jewish state to exist.
So that's a powerful response. Chairman O'Malley should tell his response. Josh on Zoom asks, did the Holocaust change Zionism? For example, are you aware of what David Ben-Gurion thought about Palestinian statehood in the 1920s?
I'm very aware of David Ben-Gurion's thinking throughout the 1920s and 30s. He was extremely conscious and deliberate about the fact that his vision of a Jewish state required the expulsion and murder of the Palestinians. He was very, very clear about that from day one. And so I don't think the Holocaust, the so-called Nazi Holocaust, changed Zionism in the sense that there was already a political movement. I mean, like the presentation that I gave earlier showed, the Balfour Declaration, all of that was going on, and and even Theodor Herzl and the whole vision of a Jewish colonial settler state came way before the Nazi Holocaust. The only way that it may have changed it is that it was used as enhanced justification for the colonial settler state of Israel. So, but I mean, the essence of Zionism was already there. It was already a colonial movement. And
it was part and parcel of British imperialism, for one thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And endorsed by Britain. And as British imperialism was overarched by US imperialism, now it's part and parcel of US imperialism.
Precisely.
Sarah on Zoom asks, US citizens fund everything Israel does through AIPAC and via rich Hollywood Zionism. What are some constructive ways people can do to defund AIPAC?
Well, I mean, I think that joining the African People's Solidarity Committee is something you can do, because AIPAC is, a component of, it's just a lobby. It's part of, colonialism and imperialism. So I think solidarity with the anti-colonial struggle of the Palestinian people and building the movement for reparations to African people, even the campaign to make Wall Street pay reparations, all of these things that we're doing to target parasitic capitalism under the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party, I think will ultimately truly deprive any, lobby or instrument of imperialism and Zionism of its resource base. So I don't know if I'm dodging the question there, but I think I really think that. I think the way to not just fund, but destroy AIPAC is to join APSC, get organized under the leadership of the African Revolution, and by extension, unite in solidarity with the Palestinian people to recapture their land.
Yeah, I really, really appreciate that. And I appreciate you asking that, Sarah, because I think it's a lot like the question that we're hearing right now about, quote, defunding the police. That actually, whatever ways or ploys different cities may be using to make the police seem like a kinder, gentler expression of what they really are. What they are, in fact, is the colonial state. So killing African people is what they do. That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to maintain and uphold colonialism through the violence of the police department, or when that is expressed internationally, it's called the military. And Chairman Omali Shatella has explained this. So there's not going to be any defunding or any kind of reform of the police departments. And the same with this AIPAC. The fact is that what has to happen is the Palestinian people must have their land, and right. Israel must be destroyed. And so, we must be part of a revolutionary movement that is about, as we're saying, as the chairman says, deepening the crisis of imperialism, working to overturn it every single day, because imperialism and the liberation of African and Palestinian people can't coexist. They can't coexist. One must go. And that must be, of course, imperialism responsible for the Palestinian suffering and the African suffering and everything else that is required for us to assume the lifestyle that we have inherited on the pedestal on the backs of everybody else. So Paula on Facebook says, I was in occupied Palestine during Desert Storm in 1990 in the war, when righteously Saddam Hussein threatened to bomb Israel. Only supplies and gas masks were handed out to white settlers. When I asked the armed pig Israeli soldier, why aren't Palestinians being given supplies and gas masks? He answered, they're not legitimate citizens. see the contradiction and the similarities to how African and indigenous people are treated here, exactly as colonial subjects. Comrade Jesse, any comments on that?
Agree. No, I unite. I appreciate that comment.
Okay, Sarah on Zoom has another question. Our police are trained via the IDF. What are some of the ways to separate average citizens from this BS Israel influence to avoid martial law in our country?
Agree. Well, I think that's an important question, because that is something that a lot of people point out. That, I mean, it is true that the IDF has given training to like the New York Police Department and stuff like that. But it's also true, and I think more important, as we were saying earlier, that Israel is an outpost of a military outpost of US imperialism. And, you know, Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces are trained and funded and propped up by US support. Without US support, it would be a very different situation for the Israelis in the face of Palestinian liberation. So I think there is a way that the question of like the influence of the IDF over the police or something like that, like somehow can obscure the true nature of the colonial state in the United States. And like, as Chairwoman Penny has talked about in the past, what the US has done, what Europe and the US have done to Africans and indigenous people has served as the template for colonial state terror and counterinsurgency for all other colonial powers around the world, including Israel. And as I mentioned earlier, most of the kind of hallmarks of Israeli counterinsurgency against the Palestinians, including the demolition of homes and things like that, are things that the British were doing when they were in Palestine. And they're also things that the police here in the United States do to African people all the time. So that's how I would answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say to Sarah, we do have martial law in this country, inside the US. We do have martial law in the African community, in the Mexican, towards the Mexican people, towards the indigenous people. They live under the colonial state. Their children, their spouses, their family members, they themselves can be shot down by the police on any given day. And generally speaking, the police do not pay a price for that, or they're rounded up and put into the largest prison population in the entire world, the Gulag. The Gulag is right here inside the US, and full of Africans, full of Mexicans, full of impoverished indigenous people on their own land. So we do have martial law. And again, that, you know, we have to say that we're anti-imperialists. Imperialism has to go. Yeah. Because colonialism will always have the colonial state. And we see that in occupied Palestine, two completely different situations and experiences by the Israelis, the white people, and the Palestinian people. So, you know, I just think, again, join the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, or the African People's Solidarity Committee, under the leadership of the African Revolution. And this is what will defeat the IDF once and for all. So Anonymous on Zoom says, European Jews have historically viewed assimilation as the answer to anti-Semitism. This has obviously not worked or produced a lasting and permanent end to anti-Semitism. This impulse for assimilation is something that is deeply ingrained in our community, that has been established from the terror of anti-Semitism. What needs to be done in order to get the European Jewish community to understand that they need to embrace their culture to fight white supremacy, and that fighting and destroying white supremacy is the only answer to their permanent security?
Uhuru. That's a great question. I really appreciate that question. And I think that one of the most important points of this study for Jewish people is that the only possibility for security for Jews or for anyone is in the destruction of this colonial capitalist system, including the state of Israel, the government and colonial settler state of Israel, that it literally has to be destroyed. The Palestinian people have to be free. And that's the only way that there's going to be any kind of security, is if that is overturned. And I think on the question of anti-Semitism, I think that like there was hatred of Jewish people and persecution and stuff like that in Europe. That is a real thing historically, but I don't really think that that word applies to what you see in the world today. Because the word anti-Semitism is often used to discredit the Palestinians, or to discredit those who sympathize with the Palestinians. And even if there is a Palestinian who sees Jewish people in an extremely negative light, that is not because of anti-Semitism. That's because of the material reality of being oppressed by Jews, being oppressed by a Jewish state with a Jewish flag that has a Jewish national anthem and tells Jews around the world that they can come there and be citizens. So I think, I think that the question is, not wanting to be part of capitalism, not wanting to, be complicit, assimilated and complicit with parasitic capitalism, breaking ourselves off from that and uniting with the Palestinians. That's the only way that there's going to be any chance of security. Uhuru.
Well, I also would like to add, I appreciate that, and I appreciate the question, that again, the Chairman Omani Shatala challenges us to be very, very specific. And we are not destroying white supremacy, because that is an idea. That is like racism. We are fighting against colonialism. And when we take a stand against colonialism, then we have unity, not with the imperialist ruling class, but we have unity. We become human beings that become totally in unity with the colonized, and that this is what has to happen in order to be part of a world in which there isn't a group of people that have pogroms and murder others and that kind of thing, because there's no colonial basis in the world for the oppressors and the oppressor and the oppressed nation. And that, the chairman has really, and this is something that we will continue to discuss in studies, but the chairman has talked about and has in the book that Jesse held up, in the Uneasy Equilibrium, and also in this book, Vanguard, The Advanced Detachment of the African Revolution, the chairman really has a brilliant analysis of the African nation. What is the African nation? And understanding that African people all around the world, Black people all around the world, are African people and part of the African nation. But he also talks about how white people, as Jesse mentioned, Europeans were individual states, but became unified as a European nation based on the colonial assault on Africa, the colonization and genocide and theft of land and resources of the majority of the people on the planet Earth. And, Jewish people in Europe, as Jesse said, that the European nation was white and Christian. And so Jewish people suffered oppression. But after Germans killed Jews, killed other white people in Germany, this is another part of the history, but Jews sought to come to the United States. They sought to come to the United States. And all during the Second Imperialist War, the US government and the so-called liberal Franklin Roosevelt refused any ships with Jewish refugees to land in the United States, and certainly not to come inside the United States. So he was really responsible for the deaths of, of this. And in fact, what the US was doing was targeting the Soviet Union and the siege of Stalingrad, like how, many millions of people were killed there. And they saw that as the enemy, not Nazi Germany in the same way. But Jews came here after the war. They came here and stepped up on the pedestal of whiteness to become white, just as Irish had, and Germans, Italians. Others came to say, I'm stepping up on that pedestal. I might be poor and oppressed where I'm from in Europe, but I'm going to become white. I'm going to be full-fledged white, which means I sit on the backs of African people and oppressed peoples and become colonizers. And that is, that's the question that, we have to commit national suicide, and we have to become human beings in solidarity with the liberation of African people and all oppressed peoples. So I don't know, Jesse, anything else you wanted to say on that?
No, I really appreciate that. And I think you kind of gave the context and response of the next question too. I think.
Yes, what do you think of the idea of Jews as indigenous peoples who need their own right to self-determination?
Yeah, I mean, I would just refer you back to the listeners back to the response that you just heard, because I feel like that really clarifies that European Jews have been part of the white nation historically and have fought to become part of that and unite with it, and that we have to commit national suicide. We have to take responsibility for that, and through solidarity with the national liberation of African people. So I mean,
Jews were indigenous to Palestine, but so were Arabs. But if one group sides with the oppressor to colonize the other, then, you don't count as indigenous, you count as the oppressor. You count as the oppressor. And that's why, that's not a legitimate statement.
No.
I appreciate you raising it. This is a really great discussion. I really appreciate it, Jacob, and everybody who has been raising this. Yeah. So Santosh is raising, thank you very much for this powerful study, comrades. Wanted to get your opinions on Mossad's reach and tutelage and arms deals with countries like US and neocolonial states like India. Thank you, Santosh.
You want to take that one on, Chairman Penny?
Go ahead. Or I can, if need be.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, you can.
Well, I mean, because again, Israel is the, is whatever they call it, the puppet state of US imperialism. So of course it does. And sometimes it's seen as the bad boy, or, oh, it's getting out of hand, but it's doing what the US wants. Overall, it's doing, you may want to get rid of Netanyahu for whatever, reason. They might want a little bit of milder front at different times. So of course, the arms deals and, Israel has nuclear power, and it's there to just be the watchdog of US imperialism. Mossad's reach is enormous, and it's doing what it's supposed to do, And states like, neocolonial states like India, it's keeping them, in the fist of imperialism.
Real.
All right, so I'm sorry, go ahead, Jesse.
No, I agree. And I mean, we could talk for hours about their, involvement in Africa, the connections between Israel and the colonial apartheid regime in South Africa, or occupied Azania. They were, Israel was involved in the splitting up of Sudan a few years ago, and many other cases. So yeah, it's definitely an instrument of U.S. imperialism, and as Chairwoman Penny said, it has tremendous reach. So that's all I would add.
Uhuru. Anonymous on Zoom, should imperialist actions from the Chinese be denounced as well? Well, that is a really good question, and something Chairman Omali Yeshitela has addressed. And, you know, the thing that the chairman says, though, is that, first of all, the US and US imperialism and parasitic imperialist powers were built on the direct imperialist assault on African people and oppressed and colonized peoples around the world. And this is how they got their power. China was not that. China was not born as an imperialist power, but it is contending with US capitalism and imperialism. It's very much contending, and it is something that's obviously deepening very much the crisis of US imperialism, as we can see. I mean, it's just desperate in relationship to China and even to Russia. And, you know, so they're not strictly an imperialist power, but they are condemned in many ways for, you know, by many African people for what they are doing in Africa, and for this ability to go in there as the friendly force, but, you know, in effect, de facto, laying out a colonialism and a dependency upon them. And so, you know, the answer that, if I understand it correctly, the answer that Chairman Omali Yeshitela is laying out is that Africa must have its own Africa plan, because China has an Africa plan, India has an Africa plan, Europe, US have a plan to keep going in there and sucking the blood of African people. But the answer is for the African revolution led by the African working class. And, you know, China also has contradictions within it. The legacy of Mao, they can't really destroy that. That's still upheld and has a lot of contradictions between the haves and the have-nots, between those who benefit from imperialism and capitalism, and those who are oppressed inside their countries. So we will continue to see this. We will continue to see this played out, but the main contradiction in the world is US imperialism, US and European imperialism, the leadership of parasitic capitalism. That's what we have to fight right now, Uhuru. Jesse, did you have anything else on that?
Uhuru, not on that specifically, but I just wanted to appreciate all of these great questions.
Yes.
And everyone who's participating on Zoom, on YouTube, and on Facebook, both on the African People's Solidarity Committee and the Uhuru Solidarity Movement Facebook pages, because this is being simultaneously broadcast in all of those places. So I just want to appreciate everybody who's participating. And I also want to appreciate you, Chairwoman Penny, and all of your leadership, and also all of your responses to these questions were really, really powerful and helpful. And I also wanted to just echo your call, Chairwoman Penny, for white people who are listening to this to join the African People's Solidarity Committee. And I guess I specifically wanted to shout out people that I work with in the Uhuru Solidarity Movement, APSC's mass organization, who already carry out incredible cadre level work in so many ways and function as incredible leaders and examples of white solidarity with Black power and the struggle for reparations. And if any of you are kind of on the fence, you've been thinking about it for a while, and you know, you're just not sure if you're ready, I just want to encourage you to take the plunge and just dive in and go to apscuhuru.org. It's a process. There's political education, there's training. It's an incredible process, and you know, it's life-changing. It's the most meaningful decision that we can make as white people in our lifetime. is to join the African People's Solidarity Committee. So anyone that you know I'm talking about you if you're one of those people that's in the ranks doing the work day in, day out to build this movement, go ahead and join the African People's Solidarity Committee. Uhuru.
Well, I just want to say that I'm so excited because we have a comment directly from Chairman Omali Shatella. Thank you, Chairman. And he's saying, Uhuru, sometimes Israel leverages its strategic significance to the US to its advantage in ways with which the US may disagree, but Israel is always a minor player in the scheme of US domination. And that is so important. You know, all the people who raise up Israel as the leader and they're tricking the US. No, you know, it's a minor player in what the US is doing. And yes, Chairman, thank you for that, because we can't begin to minimize the scope of what the US does around the world every day. And even this thing in Beirut, this so-called, you know, explosion from a ship with things, some kind of, you know, ammonium nitrate sitting there for 7 years, but it has the imprint of the US government on it. And maybe that was carried out by Israel, or maybe it was carried out directly by the US. I mean, look what the US has done to Lebanon. Look at what was called the Civil War with US-backed phalangists, just a vicious, murderous gang, you know, that was carrying out what the US wants, and the destabilization of governments, of people living. And look what the US has been doing in Syria and in Iraq and Afghanistan. You know, this must go. This must go. And there can be no peace for the white people of Israel when the entire Middle East is up in flames resisting what the US has done. So thank you very much, Chairman Omali Shatella. And again, I want to unite with what Jesse has said, that this is the time to be a cadre, to join organization, to join the African People's Solidarity Committee under the leadership of Chairman Omali Shatella and the African People's Socialist Party. And that revolution is heady, it's exciting, it's liberating for us too. It's wow, you know, just how depressing the system is. And so many white people are addicted to drugs and alcohol and just plain old suicide. And, you know, let's live, but we can't live at the expense of others. That's why we're killing ourselves. We have to live and truly understand and enjoy life for what it is to take on, you know, being part of a movement led by African and oppressed peoples to make a world in which all human beings can live. Then the chairman is saying, oh, another statement, Lebanese explosion caused by the same forces causing explosions in Iran, even as we speak. US-Israel terror in the region is legendary. Uhuru, uhuru. Thank you, Chairman. So we are going to close up now, and I just want to say a few announcements that we have coming up. First of all, please tune in to the Omali Taught Me Studies every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern, 7 a.m. Central, and 5 a.m. on the Pacific Coast, but there are many, many people out there who just watch very, very, you know, just every week. So go to the Omali Shatella Facebook page or the Burning Spear YouTube page to watch this incredible and lively, deep and profound discussion led by Chairman Omali Shatella every single Sunday. And next weekend will be the Black is Back Coalition for Justice, Peace, and Reparations, their national conference, Saturday and Sunday, August 15th and 16th. It's called Fight for Black Power, Free All Political Prisoners. Go to blackisbackcoalition.org and register. And, you know, just, this is going to be really, really amazing, and also a profound political education of the significance of the African Revolution of the 1960s. So also, if you would like to purchase any of Chairman Omali Shatella's books, such as Vanguard, his most recent book, or Overturning the Culture of Violence, written for solidarity, white solidarity, then go to burningspearmarketplace.com. And you can also get your issue of the Burning Spear. You can subscribe to the Burning Spear newspaper. And then our next African People's Solidarity Committee study will be on Wednesday, August 26th at 6 p.m. Central. It's going to be on white women and the question of colonialism. It's really going to be exciting. A discussion of the book, They Were Her Property, about white women slave owners, written by Stephanie E. Jones Rogers. And it's going to feature Yejide Orienmila, the president of the African National Women's Organization, an organization of the African People's Socialist Party, and myself. So that's August 26th at 6 p.m. And Jesse, Comrade Jesse, can you give us any last words and close us out?
Uhuru. Well, thank you so much, Chairwoman Penny, for your leadership and also for asking for me to do this study. It was a great honor. And I also want to salute and appreciate the leadership of Chairman Omali Shatella and appreciate the chairman's presence. It's a great honor to have the chairman in attendance with us in this study, and just salute the African People's Socialist Party all around the world, African people fighting for national liberation, fighting to free Africa and destroy the colonial borders. And we are waging the struggle in the white community for reparations to African people. This is our job. This is our task. This is our revolutionary assignment, to go in and unleash the stolen resources back into the hands of the African Revolution that is going to free the world of all oppression. That will be the road to the liberation of the Palestinian people, the liberation of the people of Iran, the liberation of the people throughout Latin America, and all oppressed and exploited peoples around the world. The road to the future of genuine peace and socialism is painted black. So join the African People's Solidarity Committee. Down with Israel, down with Zionism, down with colonialism, death to imperialism, victory to the Palestinian Revolution, and victory to the African Revolution.
Unity through reparations.
Uhuru.